Do you know what one of the biggest debates was in church communications in 2019? Among churches that wanted to come up with a slogan or a theme for the coming year, the debate was whether it was too cliche to use the slogan, 2020 Vision. The point being that these churches wanted to convey that 2020 was going to be the year that the church saw the year ahead with perfect clarity and charted a course saying this will be our mission. I may be wrong here, but something tells me none of these churches saw 2020 going quite like this. If I had to pick something instead, I'd probably go with 2020 Hindsight. You've probably heard the phrase, hindsight is 2020, meaning that things always appear so much clearer to us when we're able to look back at them. And here in the year 2020, we're forced to do just that. We're forced to look back on the world that came before all this and say, how did we possibly get here? Well, today's gospel reading is all about hindsight as well. As we heard, a man named Cleopas and another unnamed disciple are headed away from Jerusalem 3 days after the crucifixion. Their whole world has been just turned upside down after the death of their friend and their teacher. They're nervous, they're unsure of the future, and heck, they're worried about their own lives. And to top it all off, these two men are completely clueless when a newly resurrected Jesus begins walking alongside them on the road. The Bible says their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Now, whether that means that this was God's doing, that they were just completely blind because of their grief, or some combination of the two, we see the story show that these disciples are completely flabbergasted when Jesus acts like he has no idea about the events that have just taken place and all the mess that happened back in Jerusalem. I mean, could you imagine if someone walked up to you today and said, how come everybody's wearing face masks and why is everyone hanging out inside instead of coming out in this beautiful weather? You'd say the same thing the disciples did. Are you the only person who has no idea what's going on here? I love reading this story because Jesus just plays it cool while they're telling him everything that he has just been through. I can picture it now. So then they handed him over to be condemned to death. No way. Yeah, way. And it's been like 3 days since all of this. And now we're hearing some of the women in our group saw angels and found his body missing from the tomb. Get out. But then Jesus takes some time to give the two disciples a little bit of a reality check here. He pulls them out of their grief for a moment, and he says, are you so focused on all the bad around you that you've forgotten everything you were taught about the Messiah? All the way back to Moses, things have been leading up to this very moment. And then the big aha moment comes for the disciples when they invite Jesus to dinner. And as he's breaking and blessing the bread, they finally realize it's been Jesus walking alongside them all along. Just in time for him to do one of those Batman disappearing acts and he just totally vanishes from the room. The assigned gospel readings that fall around Holy Humor Sunday all seem so perfect for an occasion about jokes and pranks. While some people see them as stories about spiritual blindness and disbelief, I see these as stories where Jesus is a bit of a prankster. We hear about Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene at the empty tomb and she thinks he's a gardener. We hear about Jesus appearing in a locked room full of disciples except for Thomas, and he must think they're pranking him because he's the only one who hasn't seen anything. And then today's story where Jesus lets two of the disciples go on thinking he's a total stranger throughout this whole walk of theirs. Of course, each of these always ends up with everyone seeing things clearly. Well, now, speaking from experience, I can tell you that sometimes it's the prankster who needs to have that aha moment and look back on what they've done. You see, several years back, on April Fool's Day, my little cousin kept bragging about how nobody can ever prank her, and how she could prank everybody without being stopped. And so I saw that as a little bit of a challenge. And while I was listening to the radio that day, I got an idea. You see, I went on Craigslist on the Help Wanted section and I typed up an ad of my own. I wrote that I was going to be producing a radio commercial for the popular snack Pirate's Booty, and all people had to do was read the script in their best pirate voice and submit it to the name and number below. My little cousin's name and number. And then I just let the joke take off. So while my cousin was in school, her voicemails began filling up with all these strangers. And when she finally got out of school and checked her messages, the first one sounded something like this. "Arr, mateys, get yourself to the nearest dock and grab yourself a bag of pirate's booty. Arr, that's some fine booty." And granted, she was a little shocked when she got one of these messages. But imagine her reaction when there were several more messages of the same thing of different people leaving pirate impressions on her phone. Well, finally, the next person called and the phone rang while she had it in her hand. So she picked up and cut the person off before they could go on with their speech. She asked, "Where did you get this number?" To which he replied, "The Craigslist ad you put online." She had the unfortunate task of letting him know that he had been part of a nasty April Fool's prank. And I found out when I got a voicemail from my cousin saying, "Rob, I'm going to kill you." It all seemed fun at the time, until that aha moment when I had the hindsight to look back on what I had just done. Not only had I put my cousin's name and phone number out there to total strangers on the internet, I had also gotten the hopes up and wasted the time of people who were genuinely trying to find work. So, once I thought about it, that ad came down pretty quick after that. You know, sometimes we can be so focused on something, a task, an event, a tragedy, that we fail to see the big picture. We fail to look back on the things that have gone wrong, and that prevents us from discerning how we can correct them going forward. For the disciples, it was in the breaking and the blessing of the bread that their minds snapped back to that Last Supper with Jesus, before everything went so wrong, before the betrayals and the pain and the death. And at this point, not only do they remember the things that he promised them, but Jesus has now lit this fire inside them. We're told they changed course and they head right back to Jerusalem, right back to where all that trouble happened, so they can continue doing his work. We are all on a path not unlike those two disciples. We're all journeying together on the COVID road, finding it hard to talk about anything other than life in a pandemic. Behind us lies a world where many of our priorities were a bit askew, and far too many people went unvalued and unseen. In fact, this pandemic has shined a light on many of the flaws in our old way of life. Several countries, many countries, are seeing their air and water pollution clearing up, and they're at some of the lowest levels they've been in a long time. Many people are finding they actually have time to reconnect with family and friends who they haven't spoken to or made the time for in quite some time. Some of our most undervalued workers, who often receive the lowest pay, are now being recognized and praised as the most necessary people in society. But it's not all good news. The latest numbers on those being infected or dying are showing huge disparities when it comes to things like race and class and access to health care. As a recent report by Vox said, the coronavirus isn't an equalizer, but a magnifier of inequality. And yet, despite all that was wrong with our world before this, we're still grieving that way of life. We're tired of staying inside and wearing face masks and being physically distant from one another. So many people have said, I just want to be able to hug somebody again. We sound like the Israelites after they'd been freed from Egypt. Sure, things were bad before, but at least we knew what to expect. Here's the part where we need Jesus to snap us out of our grief for a moment, so we can remember what his death and resurrection taught us. That death is never the end. If we can learn to accept that the world we knew is dead and forever, dead and gone forever, we can look with hope to the resurrection of a new and better one. If we open our eyes, we'll see that Jesus has been present through every step of this journey. He's present in the nurses and doctors, EMTs and paramedics, mail carriers and delivery services, grocery store employees and restaurant staff, gas station attendants and mechanics, police and firefighters, leaders in every branch of government, and the countless other jobs who are putting themselves on the line for the good of others. Jesus may not have a physical body in our day and age, but we have to believe that there are so many who have stepped up to become his hands and feet in the world. Next Sunday, we'll all be gathering again from the comfort of our homes, watching through TV screens and computer monitors and cell phones. Pastor Kim again will lead us in the sacrament of communion. And my prayer for all of us is that as the bread is broken and the juice is poured, we can have that same aha moment those two disciples had. That Jesus will light that same fire in all of us. So when it comes time to set our feet back on the road to a post-pandemic society, we too can head right back toward the flawed world we came from and begin the work of resurrection. Amen.